Obviously, I think people are quite aware of the news. 46-year-old man, Robert Bowers, shot 11 congregants in a temple called, I think it's the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, a conservative temple, conservative in terms of its Jewish denomination, not necessarily its politics. The dead ranged in age from mid-50s to mid-90s. I think a woman who was a Holocaust survivor, actually. And my understanding is it was Shabbat services, but also there may have been a bris at the time. Four police officers also shot. The man was taken into custody. He had 21 guns registered in his name. He used an AR-15 style assault rifle and 3 handguns, according to authorities. He was loudly spewing murderous hatred and bigotry online, and as he went into the church, apparently said something to the effect of "all Jews must die." The guy's social media accounts, particularly at gab.com, had all sorts of white nationalist memes. He claimed Donald Trump's he claimed Donald Trump was not a white nationalist. That he was a globalist. I'm hearing myself come back. Whoever's got that's got to turn it down. He claimed that Donald Trump was under the influence of Jews, and was basically a figurehead, was not doing enough to stop the caravan that was coming of immigrants who represented an invasionary force that was driven by Jews. Now, if that sounds familiar to you, that narrative that there is a caravan. In fact, this guy went in and on gab.com, he was repeatedly railing against the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS, I guess, which is a Jewish refugee advocacy group. There is a fairly robust tradition in Jewish Jewish institutions that work on immigration for, I think, fairly obvious reasons. Hayes was founded in 1881. There have been various instances around the world where Jews have had to leave countries because of local repression. Hayes has partnered with the U.S. government in the past to help resettle refugees. They initially started as an organization that helped Jews and expanded their work to just refugees writ large. According to this guy, Bowers, he accused Hayes of helping transport members of the migrant caravans, supposedly showing the organizer a video that showed the organization's members working at the U.S.-Mexico border. He accused them of driving this invasion, and this is all on his Gab profile. He was Hayes he accused the Hayes of working with the State Department. And Hayes has actually worked with the U.S. government, I imagine, with the State Department to help resettle refugees as part of the refugee admissions program. Of course, many of those refugees are now, we're down to like literally 5,000 or 8,000 that we're going to allow into the country this year because of Donald Trump's so-called nationalism. But if the notion that this guy Bowers promotes, that the so-called migrant caravan that is walking through Mexico, perhaps to the United States. There are plenty of these caravans that we've had in the past. All you need to do is search caravans and Tucker Carlson, and you could see him reporting on these over the past couple of years. All the different invasions that we've had. And amazingly, we're still here. And I'm still speaking English. And we're not doing this through ham radio. This isn't a Red Dawn scenario. But apparently to this guy it was. And if you're wondering, like, where could someone possibly get this idea? Or at the very least, they're not seeing this validated anywhere, are they? Like on Fox News?
I've gotten so many emails from people who said, don't call it a caravan, call it an invasion.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Of course it is. It is a full-scale invasion by a hostile force, and it requires our president and our commander-in-chief to use any means necessary.
Pause it for 1 second. Now, when Michelle Malkin says a full-scale invasion, let's just assume that we're talking about this caravan here let's just assume there's 4,000 people, maybe less, but let's just assume it's 4,000. And we have heard in other clips from Seb Gorka saying that these are all, that many of them are military-age men. They are walking on foot, many of them carrying their toddler or elementary school-age kids. What does a full-scale invasion look like? Does it include by land, by sea, by air, long-range weapons, short-range weapons? Because these folks have none of it. Well, they have the land part. They're walking. They have no vehicles. But this is a full-scale invasion by a hostile force. A hostile force that wants to come here and work here, which is a weird thing to imagine that being the number one agenda of a hostile force. But that's what they are. It's a full-scale invasion, hostile force. Why wouldn't you go grab some arms to fight this, right? When has it been that the United States of America have been facing a full-scale invasion by a hostile force? Full scale.
By a hostile force, and it requires our president and our commander-in-chief to use any means necessary to protect our sovereignty. The reason that I called my book Invasion 16 years ago is because of Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution. And people never talk about this anymore. The constitutional imperative to provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, the people who are already here. And if that means troops on the border, yes. The problem is, of course, that the troops, because of the Posse Comitatus Act, can only serve in an administrative or support capacity. It's really a Band-Aid, and the underlying solution...
Is that the problem? That the troops at the border can't open fire on people? That's the problem. That's the problem that we have. That the troops can't fire. They can only function in an administrative function to these hostile invaders who are involved in a full-scale invasion. You see where this is going, folks? This is, incidentally, this is, Fox and Friends? This is the light show. This is the morning show.
Of course, is to finish the wall and to put more Border Patrol agents on the border. And ranchers and families have been calling for that for the 3 decades that I've been covering this issue.
Yes, 3 decades of just hyping and hyping this. And now we have a president who's fully on board. with the idea that we're being involved in a full-scale invasion, supposedly, right? Supposedly. Where could this idea, though? So we have multiple sources, including some of the highest echelons of conservative thought and Republican media in this country are suggesting that we're suffering a full-scale invasion from a hostile force. But where would someone get the idea that this is maybe a function of the Jews? Well, I mean, certainly it lives in white nationalist lore. The John Birch Society has been saying this. But where in the popular, culture could people get this notion? I got a piece here. This was written, I don't know, I guess a while ago, maybe a year or two ago, about white nationalism. And it's written by a guy named Eric Ward. He wrote this in the Public Eye magazine in the summer 2017 edition. I think he works at the Southern Poverty Law Center now, or he did then. And he's an African-American guy who, in the course of working on anti-racist activism, went undercover at a weekend in 1995 in a convention center in Seattle, which was the 6th Annual Preparedness Expo. And it's basically preparing people for political and economic collapse. And you could buy white nationalist classics like The Secret of the Federal Reserve in 52, and from 67, The Biological Jew. And he writes, despite its blood-curdling anti-black racism, at least some factions of the white nationalist movement saw me as a potential ally against their true arch-enemy. Apparently went in as a black separatist, and he told the guys, like, I don't shake white people's hands. And this guy he was talking to was like, that's cool. They went to go hear Jack Lamb, who was a Phoenix cop who ran an organization called Police Against the New World Order, make a case for temporary alliances with the blacks, the Mexicans, the Orientals against the real enemy, the federal government controlled by an international conspiracy. He didn't have to say who ran this conspiracy because it was obvious to all in attendance. He goes on to write, if I had to give a basic definition of the movement, something I've been asked to do formally and informally by folks who have spent less time hanging out with Nazis than I have, my response today would not be much different than it was when I began to do this work nearly 30 years ago. American white nationalism, which emerged in the wake of the 1960s civil rights struggle and descends from white supremacism, is a revolutionary social movement committing to building a whites-only nation, and anti-Semitism forms its theoretical core. Now, why would that be? He writes to recognize that anti-Semitism is not a sideshow to racism within white nationalist thought. This is particularly white nationalist thought, like Steve Bannon. It allows us to identify the fuel that white nationalist ideology uses to power its anti-black racism, contempt for other people of color, and its xenophobia, as well as the misogyny and other forms of hatred it holds dear. And how does it do this? What function does anti-Semitism serve? Well, one, it answers the question, how could a race of inferiors, that being basically people of color, unseated the power structure through organizing alone? For that matter, how could feminists and LGBTQ people have upended traditional gender relations? Muslims have won billions of converts to Islam. How do you explain the boundary crossing allure of hip hop, the election of a black president? It's some secret cabal, some mythological power that must be manipulating the social order behind the scenes. That's what the Jews do for the white nationalists. They give an excuse for why they are losing, because they have been stabbed in the back by people who have snuck into the power structure and are using all these other dupes as a way of controlling things. Jews function, he writes, for today's white nationalists, as they often have for anti-Semites throughout the centuries, as the demon stirring and otherwise changing and heterogeneous pot of lesser evils. He writes that the second reason the white nationalist anti-Semitism must not be dismissed, at the bedrock of the movement is an explicit claim that Jews are a race of their own, and that their ostensible position as white folks in the U.S. represents the greatest trick the devil ever played. The Bible for generations of white nationalists is the Turner Diaries. You may remember that because that was basically the controlling, I guess, structure of everything, not just Timothy McVeigh, but also Glenn Beck was operating under for years. And this is a dystopian novel by the white supremacist leader William Pierce, published under the pseudonym Andrew MacDonald. And this is where a soldier in the white Revolutionary Army insists that trying to distinguish the good Jews from the bad ones is absurd, the way some of our thicker-skulled good old boys still insist on trying to separate the good ends from the rest of their race. He writes, contemporary anti-Semitism, then, does not just enable racism, it is also racism. For the white nationalist imaginary, Jews are a race, and the race that presents an existential threat to whiteness. Anyways, this is the thoughts of this guy from a theoretical standpoint, I guess, though also based upon his day-to-day research with these people. But where can we see this notion that Jews are pulling the strings? I mean, it's at least, you know, it's like, it's one thing that it's confined to these sort of John Birch pamphlets and Elders of the Protocol of Zion pamphlets that are out there purporting to show the Jews are trying to tear down great nations through immigration, but one couldn't see this trafficked, let's say, on a daily basis, except for, when was this? Last week?
Sure. Look, this is a criminal involvement on the part of these leftist groups. It's
pause it for 1 second. This is Lou Dobbs on Fox Business Network talking to this guy from the Judicial Watch, Chris Farrell. Who apparently, you should know, Fox has now said can't come on our network.
Sure. Look, this is a criminal involvement on the part of these leftist groups. It's a highly organized, very elaborate, sophisticated operation. I have that from the highest levels of the Guatemalan government. They're investigating those groups criminally, and I strongly urge President Trump and Attorney General Sessions to do the same here. A lot of these folks also have affiliates who are getting money from the Soros-occupied State Department, and that is a very great concern. You want to start cutting money there.
Do you know? So, in other words, let's just review here. This guy has sources at the highest levels of the Guatemalan government who are telling him that this is a very sophisticated international cabal of people who are orchestrating this, what we were told by Michelle Malkin on the Light show on Fox, was that we're dealing with a full-scale invasion from a hostile, with hostile intent. And the State Department's been infiltrated by this demonized George Soros, who was also, incidentally, just coincidentally this week, targeted in a bombing attack, or would-be bombing attack. And this guy's out there promulgating this stuff. This is all part of the white nationalist formula. And this is what it's getting trafficked on a daily basis.